group of protesters saying they represented the families busted into a news conference today with a banner that read, "We oppose the Malaysian government concealing the truth." One desperate mother was dragged kicking and screaming from the room.
A mother breaks down, desperate for news. "I want my son back," she cries at one point, and collapses as she's taken away by Malaysian officials.
If we assume, for the moment, the plane did in fact end up in the Indian Ocean, as investigators now suspect, it seems particularly helpful to approach this mystery by doing what our guest Clive Irving suggested the other night. Work backward from the end of the flight. And you have to ask yourself, why would a plane end up out there, out in the middle of nowhere? There is nothing there. There is certainly no obvious reason to fly it into that remote area. And that brings us to one theory that's been floated, one that seems really worth considering, that the pilot and passengers were somehow incapacitated during the flight, and the plane flew out into the ocean on autopilot. Now, there is historical precedent for just that kind of thing happening. In fact, it's happened at least 5 times, including a Helios Airline 737 that crashed in 2005, killing all 90 people aboard. The flight that killed golfer Payne Stewart and 3 other people in 1999, a Lear jet that lost cabin pressure between Orlando and Dallas, incapacitating all on board, and then flew for hours before running out of fuel and crashing in South Dakota. Fighter jets were scrambled to intercept the flight after the pilot became unresponsive.
It's a very helpless feeling to pull up alongside another aircraft and realize that the people inside that aircraft potentially are unconscious or in some other way incapacitated, and there's nothing I can do physically from my aircraft, even though I'm only 50 to 100 feet away, to help them at all.
Joining me now is veteran airline reporter Clive Irving, senior consulting editor for Condé Nast Traveler and contributor to the Daily Beast. And Clive, take me through your piece today. You talk about how Flight 370 could have become a zombie, and it starts with this working backwards idea that you raised on my show the other night and has kind of stuck with me ever since.
Well, it looks very different if you start at the end rather than the beginning, because it's a relatively clean situation. We have only one source. No one's arguing about other sources. The source is the pinging to the satellite, and this assumes that the plane had been flying for at least, the time it had been flying for is disputed a little, because we're not quite sure, but and indeed we're not sure at all on its course. But one thing that would have happened would be that the plane flew until it ran out of gas, and when it runs out of gas, the 777 is known, as most planes should be, as a very stable aircraft, an inherently stable aircraft. So it can actually fly on the autopilot without human intervention for a very long while. And how that would end would be the fuel in one engine would dry up, that engine would close down, the other engine would still be running, so that would cause an asymmetry in the thrust of the engines. The plane would then do a kind of bank and turn and dive into either land or water.
Now, when you think about precedents here, and one of the things I find just from a hypothesizing perspective, a basic rudimentary sort of logical perspective, appealing about this and theoretically, is that there are precedents of this kind of thing happening. We've talked about some of the flights in which crew or passengers incapacitated, the flight flies on. There is, as far as I can tell, no precedent for some kind of foul play motivation by a pilot and a co-pilot. There's been pilot suicides, there's been hijackings, but as far as I can tell, we've been unable to find evidence that anything like this, like what is being essentially alleged by Malaysian authorities, has ever happened before.
No, there's one important difference between what seems to have happened here and those other incidents that you've talked about, which is that this plane lost all contact. In the case of the other planes, the communications between the plane and the ground didn't get lost. The equipment was still working. They just couldn't raise anybody. The people, in the case of the 737 in the Mediterranean, the passengers and the crew were unconscious. One of the many problems in this case is, one of the many anomalies, if you like, of this case is that it doesn't fit exactly into any other scenario. I'm used to analyzing crashes and extrapolating from the precedents, and then you begin to, most crashes are a combination of a series of events which unhappily combine into one moment. We can't see where those precursors for this accident are, if it's an accident. Now, there's another important point here, because I think from the beginning this investigation, if there is an investigation, has been quasi-criminalised, and every time some new piece of evidence appears, it's given a sinister meaning. Like the simulator in the pilot's home is now being cast there as something sinister, that he deleted something from the hard drive. Well, we delete stuff from our hard drives all the time. So I think that I'd like to see this investigation become a lot more neutral than it has. I think there's a lot of prejudice being directed at two targets: that either someone in the list of passengers or the flight crew. You wouldn't normally, in a crash investigation, do that at this point.
I have to say, I agree that there's a mismatch in the degree of suspicion that seems to be emanating from the authorities and sources from the investigation and the public data that we've gotten that would cast aspersions on them. And I think you're right to point that out. Clive Irving from the Daily Beast.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.